All right. So you said that you started bobsled at 15, 16.
Mhm.
How? Do you come from a family of bobsledders? Was
I
this
do
just
not. So it was actually kind of funny. I was going to boarding school from when I was 13 or so. And then I had a biology teacher in the boarding school who noticed that I wasn't doing any competitive sports because most people either played hockey or skied, and I did neither. I just recreationally skied. And he invited me on a weekend activity to go bobsledding through a junior program that they had at the track. And I said yes. And I ended up loving it and I kept on doing it. And then Youth Olympic Games rolled around and they didn't actually have any other women doing it under the age of 18 at the time. They couldn't really find anybody. And they just asked me if I wanted to go to Youth Olympic Games, which is how I like really started bobsledding from there.
do most people who start in bobsledding actually start in bobsledding, or do they come from a different winter sport?
They come from a different winter sport. Typically you go in through the combine when you're about between 22 to 26, I would say, I would say a typical range. We of course have some younger ones and some older ones, but you normally come from a separate sport like track. Some people come from softball. There's a couple of other sports that we have a variety from, but yes, typically you come from another sport and come into bobsled.
So did you come from track?
I ran track in high school a little bit, but overall I didn't have a very strong athletic background before I started bobsledding.
Is there a sport? I know that you were kind of pinpointing sports that naturally move into bobsledding, but is there one that has specific skills that are advantageous to eventually getting into bobsled?
I would say track, I would probably top that as one of our best sports to start out with. And then maybe football would be another one for running backs, but track, because we push a sled, sprinting mechanics translate really strongly over from to bobsled to pushing a bobsled.
Wow. See, I would just never think that.
Yeah.
That's really cool. But when you started bobsledding, I mean, 15, 16 is pretty young, regardless of what sport you're in.
Yeah.
Were you always on the younger end?
Yeah, most of my teammates are between 7 to 10 to 12 years older than me. And so, yeah, I kind of take up the bottom end of the young athletes. And we have a couple ones who are like 24, 25 or so, so kind of near me, but no, I'm the only teenager in the sport right now. But
Wow.
we have one younger pilot actually who just came in, but she's also doing the Youth Olympic Games.
What does being on the developmental team mean? Does that kind of get you noticed, but not quite on the actual like
Yeah.
circuit?
So I used to do the youth circuit, which was kind of just by myself, which is Youth Olympic Games. You compete against other kids your age, and then that kind of fades out when you're 18 and you move into like the general circuit, which is we have two kind of sections. We have developmental, I guess, well, we have like NAC, which North American circuit, and we have World Cup circuit. And then developmental pilots are kind of people who came in the last couple of years who are still learning how to drive and such. But being a developmental pilot means I'm still learning my abilities to drive and I'm still learning tracks and such. Whereas on the national team, you're on the team and you're a developed pilot.
Does everyone go through that developmental phase, or is this kind of a newer process?
For pilots, yes, absolutely. You have to go through a developmental phase because you need to really learn how to drive the tracks. It takes about 5 to 7 years to become a decent driver. And so you need those years under your belt to really understand driving tracks and such.
5 to 7 years sounds like a long time.
Yeah, it is a long time.
Is there like a reason behind that period of time?
Well, if you think about it, the best way I can explain it is it takes us 1 minute to get down the track. And if you play a soccer game for an hour and a half, 2 hours or so, we only have practice time every time we go down the track for 1 minute, and we take 3 to 4 runs maybe. So that's 3 to 4 minutes a day that we get of practicing driving. And say we get, who says like 40 to 60 days total of driving, maybe 80 days, we're only putting in a couple hours a year of actually learning how to drive, if even hours. So you need like hours and hours and hours of developing that skill before you can really become competent in it.
Wow, yeah. So you're in a monobob.
I do
Yes.
monobob, and I just started two women really the last year or two.
How does that differ in your roles?
So monobob, I'm just by myself. So I single-handedly push the sled and then jump into it and start driving. Whereas a two woman, I also push the sled from the side, but I have the assistance of a brake woman behind me.
And does that differ with your training, or are you still training individually?
What do you mean by that? Like how
So
I,
I've talked to some athletes who are in synchronized sports, and they go through everything together. They live
yep.
together, they eat together, they train together. Is it like that when you're working with one other person?
I would actually say it's not really like that. When it comes down to the competition, we compete together, but overall we pretty much train by ourselves. Like we train as a team when we're together as a team, but we don't have organized lifting times that we go to there together or organized track times that we go together. It's kind of we just do it on our own accord.
Is that a normal process, or is that because you're still in the developmental phase?
I believe it's mostly a normal process. Everyone has a lot of people actually have private coaches and such. We don't all have like the same exact coach who tells us exactly what to do for all of our training programs. We do have the same driving coaches, depending on your level, but all of our lifting coaches and our sprinting coaches may differ.
So how does someone figure out that they're a good pilot?
A good pilot, I would say it always depends on who you ask. Because some people could say you get reps and reps and reps, and so you understand the track more and how to get down it safely, or it's just about feel, like you understand the feeling of going around a corner and how to best navigate the sled around it.
And then I also saw that you are completely self-funded.
Yes, we are self-funded athletes.
Is that more difficult? I mean, that's just another place to put your energy.
Yes, that is a whole other aspect of the sport that is extremely difficult. You have to raise your own funds for everything. We, especially as pilots, we buy our own runners. And sometimes we even have to ship our own sleds every once in a while if the sled shipping isn't covered by anything, which can be up to 15 grand if you're going to Europe. So yeah, it's a lot of stress. It involves a lot of sponsorship, asking for money, and it's just something that you have to be able to put yourself out there for, which can be really uncomfortable sometimes, is asking people for money in general. But you just have to be willing to do it.
And when you were entering the sport, you were also in high school.
I was in high
So
school and now I'm in
how did that period work?
it was pretty interesting. I did miss a lot of school. And then my senior year of high school, I did online school actually for the first 3 quarters. And then the last quarter was happened to be COVID. So I actually stayed online my entire year of my senior year of high school. So I always joke around that I dropped out of high school my senior year because I was traveling for Youth Olympic Games. But I was on the online school.
I mean, just another thing to add to the list
Yeah.
of places where your efforts are going. But
Yes, and now I'm in college, which has been almost more difficult to balance because it's a much higher course load. And COVID was actually one of the best things that ever happened to me my freshman and sophomore year because I could just leave on my own accord and just join class from remotely, which was totally awesome for traveling and such. But now it's a little more difficult being person classes, and my professors are very accommodating to me though.
well, good. So let's also talk about representing Team USA in the Youth Olympics and then moving into women's monobob
Mm,
competition.
yeah.
What is the difference, both training wise, competition wise, day of competition?
I would say for Youth Olympic Games, I was so young and so new to the sport. It was essentially my first year bobsledding. I didn't have a training plan. I had never pushed a bobsled before. I was one of the brand new pilots in there. So I was completely different. One, I was still so nervous to just get down the track. I was still nervous that I was just like not able to like get myself down the track safely. I never crashed, thankfully. My first year, at least, I didn't have quite a few crashes after that. But my first year, I would say Youth Olympic Games was it was almost more stressful in a way because I was not used to anything. I had never been in that elite of a competition before. I was competing internationally amongst like 20, 25 other nations sometimes. So that level of competition was brand new to me and it was a little more stressful to me. But now I would say I'm a lot more used to that role. I can comfortably I can get in a bobsled now and just know that I can get myself down safely because I understand the tracks a little bit more. But day of racing, I would still say I still have nerves now. Just before because I was so new, I didn't have this like pressure on myself to perform. But as I've gotten older and actually understand the bobsledding a little bit more, I more of a pressure on myself to perform well instead of just get myself down the track.
Can you tell me what years and how old you were when you were competing in the Youth Olympics?
I was 16, and I went to the Youth Olympic Games in January of 2020 at 16 years old.
What do you think that Team USA sees in you?
I am a very hard worker, and I think a lot of people in my federation see that. I have always sometimes over applied myself to things, but I try to always get it done. I'm in school, I work, and I do bobsled. So I think they really see that I'm a really hard worker and I have a lot of commitment to the sport.
You're balancing a lot of things while also being a competitive athlete. Other competitive athletes that I talk to are dedicated to their sport. How does that diversify how you spend your time?
I don't have a ton of free time. My summers are really brutal most of the time. In school, I try to work a little bit less, or I don't work at all because I just don't have the time when I'm going to full-time classes and such. I take 16 credits. But I would say that I definitely stress myself out a little bit too much sometimes because I'm always doing something, especially in summers. I train for upwards of like 6 hours a day in total, and then I work 8 hours a day, and then I have to do school late at night. So I'm always doing something, I would say.
What is the most distinct difference between youth monobob and women's?
The actual well, the sled changed when I did youth Olympic games from when I do from now the current monobob. At the time, they didn't have a standard regulated sled. Well, they did, but then IBSF changed. Our International Bobsled Skeleton Federation changed the sled model, and so now it's a slightly different variation that I haven't driven yet to what women's monobob looks like now. But back then, the monobobs were all the same.
And then as I'm looking at this timeline that we've kind of pieced together, you were going to the Youth Olympic Games at 16. You had just joined the sport a year prior, if that. And then at 17, you get your diagnosis.
Mhm.
Was there anything that tipped you off, like, hey, I may have something mentally not
I realized that
correctly?
I was going through periods of time where I was not sleeping, doing 14 hours of work in a day without stop, and then all of a sudden I would have these crazy burnouts where I would get severely depressed and I would never want to do anything. I was always lying around and I would be like super unmotivated and not want to do anything. And then it was mostly the biggest thing for me was the not sleeping and extremely impulsive decisions. That was the real thing that would made me go to a psychiatrist, and explosiveness as well.
And then what did they tell you when you presented those symptoms?
The psychiatrist, at the end of our meeting, after she asked me a bunch of questions, the very first thing she said was that I presented with bipolar 1 disorder based on the length and severity of my symptoms. And the best way to treat it would always be medication, but I was pretty resistant for the first year that I got my diagnosis. I think that I was kind of more in denial because I was just like, there's no way I have bipolar disorder, because I think I've always had this view of myself or view of bipolar disorder that you like can't be a functional human, or you can't have a like good life if you have bipolar, which was my own prejudice against the disorder, which I eventually came to terms with and realized that no, that is completely false, and you can live a very happy, productive life no matter your diagnosis.
Did you know anyone else with BPD when you were diagnosed?
Yes, I knew actually my very best friend has bipolar disorder as well.
And then did you talk to that person about what you were going through at the
Yes, I did. And she was very supportive of me throughout the entire process. She had just experienced it a year or two prior of being diagnosed, and it was actually really helpful to have somebody in my corner who completely understood what I was going through.
Speaking of having someone in your corner, you went to a third-party psychiatrist. Was
Mhm.
there anyone within the Team USA structure that was also helping?
No, not at all. I was very resistant to even make that public before my Voice in Sport article. I had a realization that it needed to be talked about, and the reason why I had my own prejudices before I came to terms with it was because it is a stigma. There's a massive stigma going on around any mental illness, and it was one of the reasons why I was like, I have to keep this locked down. I can't tell anybody. Like nobody can ever find this out about myself. And then I just had this realization where I was like, that's absolutely not the way it should be.
I feel like I talk to a lot of athletes who, when they first are kind of coming to terms with their mental health struggles, they're like, I didn't want to tell anyone. Like, I kept it from everyone. I kept it from my family, from my significant other, from my coaches. And I just had an episode a couple weeks ago where I was talking to an athlete and she goes, I kept this from my coaches for a decade. because I was so worried that I would get kicked off the team if they
Yeah.
knew something, some kind of negative ramifications would occur and they would keep me away from my sport. And then I went back to this coach a decade later and said, hey, I had this issue. And the coach was like, oh, okay, cool.
And that's exactly what I've realized happens 95% of the time, is everyone's like, oh, okay. But
Yeah,
then a part of me also wonders is if because a lot of people can't tell that I have bipolar disorder because I do a very good job of keeping it under wraps, that they find it okay because I don't present with symptoms very much to themselves in person. So I wonder if often they're just like, okay, because they're like, oh, this is not a crazy one. She's okay. But then I wonder if that stigma does translate over for people who do present with symptoms to the public.
yeah, I think that's an interesting distinction to make as well, because even if you don't present outwardly with symptoms, you're still struggling internally.
Exactly.
How does that impact your training regimen?
The depression will get pretty bad sometimes when it comes to training. I go through episodes, I would say probably about once a month for about a week or so, where it is extremely hard to train. I have no motivation. I don't want to do anything. I'm just in bed. It's really hard to socialize, and a lot of my training is, I train at the Olympic Training Center for the majority of my training, and it's one-on-one training a lot of the time with just my coach or just a push coach or just with like 3 other athletes. So it's a lot of socializing, a lot of interpersonal socializing, and I just don't have the motivation or the mentality to do that at that time. And so the depression will really kick me for training often, and even mania every once in a while. I get so overwhelmed and distracted because when I'm manic, I do so many things all the time without thought. I just go and go and go that I'm like, wow, now I'm out of time to train. And I've almost become so distracted that with all these decisions that I'm making that I don't have time to train.
And then prior to telling Voices in Sport about what you were going through, what were you telling your coaches when these weeks were going by?
Absolutely nothing. I would completely keep it under wraps to myself. I would tell them that I wasn't feeling well, and that's almost easier now. I actually recently had an episode about a month ago, and I've been working one-on-one with this lifting coach, and I just told him, I was like, I'm going through a really bad spot right now with my mental health, and I can't train for a week, and I know I won't be able to train. I won't be coming out of my room very much. And he was like, okay, that's okay. Take your time. And I think a part of me was so afraid that my coaches would just be like, oh no, you have to train. Like, you're not being a good athlete if you don't train. And it's absolutely not the case. I've just learned through all of my coaches that whether it's physical or mental, you need to take your breaks and you need to take them.
And I think that because you're an elite athlete, it doesn't change the fact that you still need breaks.
Yes, exactly.
Do you think that it's more important to take breaks now that you are gaining speed, pun unintended, in the sport that you're doing?
Oh, absolutely. I think that if I didn't take breaks, I would become so overwhelmed that I would just simply burn out and I would have nothing left inside of me. And I need to be able to acknowledge that I need breaks within myself. I can't just go and go and go all the time. I need to take some time off. I need to take some breaks, or else I'm just going to completely burn out and lose everything.
Have you ever gotten close to feeling like that?
A couple of times. It's always the same. It's always after I've been, especially before I was medicated, I would get so manic for so long. And when you're manic, you sign yourself up for a lot of things because you fully believe that you can accomplish absolutely anything when you have when you're in that state of mind. And I'll sign myself up for absolutely everything, try to accomplish everything, and just very much burn out. And I feel like my mania will often present differently than a lot of other people's who make really impulsive, rash decisions. And I do that. I like, my rash decisions are signing myself up for as many things as possible, thinking that I can overcome anything, and not being able to do it and having a crashing and falling, burning out after the end of it.
What do you think it is about bipolar disorder that is most misunderstood? I mean, I think that you kind of captured that perfectly when you said that you're not presenting with symptoms, so people don't look at you and say, oh, she has bipolar disorder.
Exactly. I would definitely say probably a grand majority of people who you meet who have bipolar disorder, when you first meet them, it will take a long time spending time around them. You won't notice that they have bipolar. You will absolutely not notice it. You will maybe notice that they go through ups and down periods and they're like, oh, they're just moody. They're just not feeling it today, when they're really deeply struggling internally.
Are there any other athletes that you train with or know that are not necessarily going through BPD, but something else that impacts them mentally?
I actually don't, which is very surprising for my team. I still believe that it is too closeted of a topic to really be that open about it. And so there could be absolutely could be athletes who are struggling as well that I'm just not aware of.
Do you think that in the context of Team USA, they have an open dialogue started? Or do you think that there still needs to be work done?
I think they're making steps towards it. We always get our emails about our local mental health counselors who are available to us, but I really haven't noticed any open dialogue that Team USA has about mental health. Like really, to me, Simone Biles was the very first time that I'd ever even really, I was so proud of her. I was so happy that finally discussion was open that an elite athlete, especially at her level, the top of the top, had mental health issues because we all do. Every single one of us. Depends, it doesn't matter the severity of them, but we are all going through something at one point or of time or another, and it's okay to step down and tell yourself that it's you need to take a break.
I I feel like we every single athlete that comes on this podcast owes some of their story to Simone Biles.
I completely agree.
She comes up almost like clockwork every episode.
Yeah,
But it is people like her that allow people like us to have this conversation so candidly. And like I can't thank her enough. Like I owe a lot of the work that I do to people like her, people like Kevin Ware and all of these people who have become so public with mental health struggles, whatever they are, whether it's anxiety or depression, something clinical versus performance. And I think that the people that I talk to are kind of half clinical psych and half performance psych. And I think that that's an interesting distinction to make as well, because you can have pre-performance anxiety and not have an anxiety disorder.
order exactly.
And you can also have bipolar disorder that doesn't impact your performance.
That's yep.
So
I yeah.
it's just an interesting way that sport and perfectionism and elite sport specifically impacts mental health struggles and vice versa.
Exactly. I completely agree with that statement.
How have you seen that in your personal life play out?
My impact with bipolar, my personal life.
Mhm.
I would definitely say I struggle with relationships sometimes, and not just boyfriend, girlfriend, friends, but like all sorts of relationships across the board. I notice that I really have a hard time not just maintain I can maintain my friendships, but I can often be very like explosive sometimes or very especially when I'm manic or even depressed because anger is very tied in hand with depression is just explosive episodes every once in a while, which just makes it really hard to maintain friendships sometimes. And sometimes it's just me not being responsive or at all when I'm depressed and I'm just not available to communicate or have any form of extroversion inside of me to be able to socialize with everybody else.
Does that make it more difficult when you are training?
Yes, much more difficult, mostly because we train in such small groups. We're not in a huge team. We're all bobsled is a 1, 2, 4 person sport. And although we are a team together, we're not competing as like a soccer team of like all of us competing at the same time. So it's very interpersonal when we train. And it does make it very difficult sometimes when I'm just simply not feeling it to go out there.
Have you ever had a competition during one of those episodic weeks?
This is really funny you ask this because I always say that bobsled, especially racing, severely it contributes to my mania a lot. I always feel like not I always describe this like almost like overbearing excitement when I'm manic, and I have that a lot when I'm training or I'm racing. So I Bob's and it doesn't necessarily contribute to mania, but almost make my depression feel better every once in a while because I'm so excited about what I'm doing that I would say that bobsled almost helps my bipolar disorder a little bit more because I'm so focused on just the sport itself that almost everything else goes away.
Wow. And then how do you work through those mental health struggles while knowing that you have to get this bobsled from point A to point B?
I would say that I have a like place that I go to. I always mentally prepare before I go down. Almost every pilot does. you just need to be in the same mental spot every time you go down with utter focus, utter clarity. Nothing else distracts you. And everything else completely goes away when I'm that focused. There are no distractions that I have, no mental health issues that are bearing at me. When I am ready to slide, like I am ready to go down, I'm in that mental space and I can take myself down safely.
Speaking of safety, knock on wood, but when I watch the Olympics, I almost expect something to go wrong in bobsled, which sounds terrible, but there seems to be very little margin for error in the sport.
There is not a lot of margin for error. We have to be, especially pilots, we have to really be on our A game. We have less than half a second to decide what's coming up next once we're inside a corner. So we have to really, we don't have a lot, we can be late, we can be early. If we're late, we can crash. If we're early, we can crash at the end. There is not a lot of margin for error. And if you don't crash, it's going to be a really bumpy ride going down.
How do you prepare for those bumps and bruises?
Before the first year they did get to me, I was like, wow, this sport really hurts. But when you're going down like so fast and there's so much coming out you all at once, I don't even feel it. Like I feel it at the end. I'm like, damn, my body hurts. But going down, like I don't even notice my head hitting. I don't notice my shoulders being smacked really around. Like I'm just so mentally focused and so in the zone that everything else just washes away behind me.
What is your pre-performance routine?
I do a mind run, which is where I mimic holding onto the D-rings in my hands. And I just pretend that I'm pulling them back and forth as I go down the track in my head, I do that a couple times to get myself prepared and situated. Then I really just sit there, no music, just sit there by myself alone and just like cross my hands and just close my eyes. And I put myself into this mental space that I can always get down the track in.
Do you have anyone that's taught you those kind of imagery and mindfulness exercises to do, or have you just kind of made them up?
Every coach will tell you that you need to do mind runs. Mind runs are it's the only way. We only have a minute to go down the track every time we go down, but you can go down the track endless amounts of times in your mind. You can picture the track and go down and picture yourself steering yourself around the track. And it's just another way to refresh your brain and get yourself ready to go down.
Let's talk day of race. What time are you waking up? What time is the race? What are you doing in between that time?
That's a pretty hard one. I'm not, when I wake up, I am in the zone. That the starting of the day, I'll probably wake up, depending on the race, around 7 or 8 a.m. I immediately eat breakfast because I don't like eating too close to sliding or too close to any sort of physical activity within like 3 hours or so. And so I'll probably eat breakfast around 7:30, 8. If we say we have a 1 p.m. race, we'll get to the track. I would probably say around 10, maybe 10:30 or 11. The sleds go up. We go in the sled truck with them, and then we're all up at the top. I would say probably about 2 hours before our race, maybe an hour. And an hour is cutting a little close. I would say 2 hours, hour and a half. And we all start warming up. All the teams, every international team is warming up outside. Either there's a start track at some tracks, or no, it's not start track, but like a warm-up track, or just on the parking lots outside.
What kind of exercises are you doing in that warm-up?
Sprint drills pretty much. Everything reflects a sprint drill. I'll do some plyometrics sometimes to potentiate my body for pushing. But I would say it's a lot of sprint drills and just warming your body up.
What is the most common injury in bobsled?
Most common injury? It depends on what you think of injury. I would say ice burn for like really painful injuries. It's when you crash, and it happens to a lot of men because they're a little bit bigger, so their backs stick out a little bit more, but they'll crash. They'll go over, they're on their side, and the ice will rub against their skin and even not their skin, their suit, and then their burn suit, and then through their skin, and it'll turn like black, and like you need skin grafts sometimes. It's more common than a lot of other like serious injuries, but it happens pretty often. You don't always need a skin graft, but the most severe cases you do.
Wow.
Yeah. And then I would say in the Youth Olympic Games circuit, I had a friend break her collarbone from hitting against the sides many times. I would say shoulder injuries are actually pretty common within the sport.
Is that because that's what's exposed?
We're going against the side so much, and if you crash, you can really press your shoulder up against there. I remember I had frozen shoulder for a little while, which is not a severe injury, but it was just really annoying because my shoulder blade wouldn't pop out of my shoulder or my back at all. It was just like stuck until I had physical therapy, and it finally released. But I would say a lot of shoulder injuries happen. And
Frozen
injuries,
shoulder?
sorry,
Did you say frozen shoulder?
frozen shoulder. Yeah.
Is that a colloquial term within the bobsled community, or is that a medical term?
I'm pretty sure it's a medical term. That's what my therapist described it as.
That's so interesting. But I also had written down the impact of sport-related injury, but I also wrote not always broken, but always bruised.
Always bruised. I will have bruises going up and down my arms, my legs, every place you're like, why does she have a bruise there? I will have a bruise there. Back of my legs, like I get bruised absolutely everywhere.
Do you ever look at yourself after a competition and go, is this worth it?
I no, actually, I'm always so excited. I love sliding so much. Like I love to train for it, of course, but the actual driving portion of bobsled is what I absolutely live for. I love to drive, I love to go fast, I love to do crazy things, and I love adrenaline, and that's exactly what the sport is.
Do you think that, and it's interesting that you mentioned adrenaline because I've only had a handful of winter sport athletes on, and I swear these people are the most adrenaline junkie type people I've ever met in my whole life.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because then I talk to summer sport athletes and they're not like that. I mean, they're elite athletes, so they are looking for perfection, they are looking for excitement. But there's something about skiers and snowboarders and bobsled that is just a different level of intensity.
We're all just crazy. That's what I always say about us. You cannot, especially the sliding sports, I've always said that you cannot do the sport and be like perfectly intact. Like you have to be like, you have to crave a little bit of craziness, a little bit of adrenaline if you want to do the sport, because at the end of the day, no matter what sliding sport you're doing, skeleton, bobsled, or luge, you're going 70, 80 miles an hour down a track, head first, feet first, sitting up. Like you are going so fast and it is so dangerous. And you have to just be okay with that.
That's epic.
Yeah.
Do you find that the athletes that are drawn to winter sport reflect the sport that they're in, or did they start somewhere else?
I would say they definitely reflect the sport that they're in, especially staying at the Olympic Training Center where we have so many sports come in and out through camps or such. I stayed there for about 3 months this summer. And so we just watched all these sports, and you can always tell who's a bobsledder, one, based on their physique, and two, just who they are. They're all a little crazy. Skeleton people always have their own group. You can totally tell. And luge, same thing. You always know exactly who's who.
That's funny. Do you think that there is a certain type of person that's drawn to bobsled?
To bobsled? Well, really, when you try, I think some people do have the intent of doing bobsled, but often when you try out, you're trying out for bobsled and skeleton at the same time to see which is going to fit you more. Luge is a lot different. You have to try out when you're much younger, 10, 11, 12 or such. Bobsled, it's, yeah, as I said, like 22, 26, even a little older, a little younger sometimes. And adrenaline junkies is the same thing. Everyone who does, well, also sometimes every once in a while we have some people who try out, because you don't try out in the sliding portion of things, you try out in the pushing portion of things at first for the traditional trajectory you go on, and then you get into bobs and you're like, whoa, this is not what I signed up for. This hurts, this is scary, I don't want to do this.
And then years later, you're like, wow, I'm a Team USA bobsledder.
Yeah.
How did we get here?
Exactly.
So you will see this timer counting down. We have 2.5 minutes left. Once it goes off, the same information will roll over. Zoom is weird. It caps meetings at 40 minutes. I normally go about an hour.
Okay, that's good.
We're gonna run a little less than that because I do have another interview directly after this.
Yeah.
But yeah, once once this ticks down and we disappear from screen, don't worry, just log in with the same credentials I gave you on Instagram and we can continue.
Absolutely.
But related to staying at the Olympic Training Center, did you ever go there as a child and just look at what was happening in Lake Placid?
I went there when I was like 16 once or something. I had to grab some gear, I think, and I was just remember being like, wow, these people are very strong. These are some of the strongest, most athletic people I've ever seen in my entire life. I just feel like, whoa, this is really crazy. This is what I'm supposed to be one day? No way. And then here I am, like now staying in a training center for a period of time, and I'm like, oh, okay, this isn't too bad.
That's awesome. Do you feel like bobsled and the winter sliding sports in total are, how do I want to say this, are more susceptible to long-term burnout?
That's a good question. What do you mean by long-term burnouts? Like they're more susceptible to quitting at any point.
Essentially, yes.
I would say what would really get to a lot of people is the commitment, because it is a huge commitment. You have to be able to fund yourself to travel with the team all on your own accord, take off from work. And so I would say it's less about burnout from sliding or from sport. And of course, after a little while, 10 plus years or so in the sport, your body does get a little bit tired. But I would say especially from my experience as development athletes, of course, I don't know as much about the national team, the senior team level, but from a development athlete's standpoint, I would say the commitment is really what gets to people the most.
What are typical bobsled back? What I was going to say before Zoom cut me off was going to be asking you, what is a typical lifespan of a bobsledder career?
It can really range just depending on how long you want to stay in the sport and how long your body can really afford to. We have bobsledders as old as 36, 37, even 38 years old sometimes. And that's actually, I would say, a pretty typical age if you like are trying to retire as long as possible, is to go into your late 30s. And then some people will only go to 1 or 2 Olympics, not even go to the Olympics, just decide after a certain point that they're just done with the sport and they'll be in their like early 30s or so, mid 30s. But typically you don't see anybody before their 30s retire.
What makes a good bobsled pilot?
A good bobsled pilot, couple of things. I would say one, you have to be a team player. You're organizing a lot of what's going on, the brakewoman and such. Like you're rotating through brakewoman often. You have to have consistency with them. You have to be in complete synchronization with them when you're going off the start. So teamwork and leadership are 2 huge qualities of bobsled pilot outside of the sliding aspect of things. 2, the ability to really just focus. There's no other way I can describe it other than just being able to have that like mental space that you can get to where nothing else bothers you and nothing else is like coming at you. You mess up a corner, you can't think about it because you have 10 other corners coming up. And if you think about it, you're going to mess up every single one. And if you're late for one, you're late for the next 3.
Let's talk about that perfectionism. This does not seem like a sport where that is helpful in any way.
Perfectionism, right? It's hard to be perfect in the sport, especially driving. You can mess up things by up to 1 centimeter and you cannot worry about that. You cannot be like, oh my goodness, I was a little bit late on that corner. Now I'm a little bit late on the next one. You just have to get ready to be late for the next one. So you can correct it by the following corner and be okay with that. But you absolutely cannot it's the biggest lesson I had to learn probably as a pilot as well, is you cannot get worked up over things that are happening in prior corners. If I really messed up corner 4, okay, so what? Corner 10 is my next goal. Not even my next goal. I want to be back in my same mental space that I was in by corner 5. I can't think about what happened in corner 4. I just to be ready to accommodate for my mistakes and get ready to keep on going.
How quickly are you making those shifts and changes?
Extremely quickly. By the end of the track, you could be, once you get in a corner, you have probably less than half a second to decide what you're going to do. Not decide, like we all have a relative program, we all have slightly different driving styles, but relative program to what we're following in each corner. And like, you just have to be ready to accommodate to your program in no time whatsoever. If you have a straightaway, great. You can think about what's coming up next, maybe. Otherwise, some corners are just corner to corner. You come out of one, you're immediately in the other.
When you're in a sport that is more competing against yourself than it is competing against others, how does that shift the way that you prepare?
Like competing against others on my team or within like others internationally.
Internationally.
I would actually say still at this level, I am competing against myself the most. Like I'm always just trying to better myself. And so I think I almost put more pressure on myself to perform more than anything, like less about like who can I beat, but how can I best perform as my own self. And it doesn't really change exactly how I perform. It's more just an extra pressure that I put on myself. I feel like that I probably should eliminate at this point. But I definitely put a little extra pressure on myself to like perform to like the best standard I previously performed to.
Speaking of tracking progress, do you ever look back and say, this is where I was, and now I'm spending months on end at the Olympic Training Center?
Yes, definitely. Especially back in my younger years when I had a little bit of sliding time, but I was mostly just sliding alone by myself with like one other coach or something. And I never really had like the team aspect of things. Like I didn't work with the team. They knew a little bit who I was because I was kind of around. I was just a younger pilot. I was a youth pilot who was just sliding for youth Olympic games, but I wasn't really at that level now. And then now I'm at that level kind of, and I'm like, wow, this is really crazy. I did make it here.
That's insane. Looking forward to 2026, what do you need to do to make yourself a threat?
I would definitely say my pushing is where I need to work on the most. That's definitely it's really interesting because I'm in a weird position because a lot of other pilots and brakemen have had this D1 experience where they really just learned to be an athlete in college and learned how to train. In high school, they trained really hard, but I've always played sports my entire life, but I've never played super elite sports where I was training outside the practice field or anything like that. So I never lifted weights. I never really ran. I had a little bit of that when I went to youth Olympic games, but overall I've only had about 1 year of training under my belt. So I've significantly improved from last year from where I was with training in terms of running and lifting. I couldn't lift any weight last year. I was like 30 pounds lighter, but now that was another thing. I was a super small pilot. I was under 140 pounds, which is like absolutely ridiculous. You just really shouldn't be under like 150, 155, really even like, I would say 160 is a great weight to be at. You're still a little bit even on the tiny bit of the lighter side there, but 160, 165 or so. It all, of course, depends on other pilots. We have pilots who are much bigger, who use smaller brake women because we have weight limits in the sled and such. But it all completely depends. Like we have pilots to 185 pounds, and they're fantastic brake push pilots.
Speaking of cycling through that other person in your sled, what is the turnover rate of that other person?
For me right now, it is very high. I have not slid with, I actually, in November of last year in Park City, I had one woman that I pretty much slid with the entire time, and it was really fun. We had a great time together. It was great we were so consistent together. It was awesome. Our timing was always on point, which is what you really develop when you have somebody that you slide with for a long time. I know at the senior level, the national team level, you will have people that you're a lot more consistent with that you slide with. So you can develop that synchronization that you need at the start, because you really want to get off that sled together at the exact same time to break that inertia most efficiently.
Did you expect the amount of science and math that goes into this sport when you started?
Not at all. I did not expect the science whatsoever. My favorite quote is, I've always learned more physics in bobsled than I ever learned in general physics.
Do you think that is specific to winter sport athletes and bobsled specifically? Or do you think that is just like an elite sport epiphany?
I'm because I don't really have a grand understanding of summer sports. I don't really know if they're also going to the same thing of understanding mechanics. What I personally would believe is that they're understanding their bodies a little bit more. And of course, we have to understand our bodies completely to be able to train most efficiently. But in terms of the mechanics of bobsled, we're just manipulating so many forces so greatly all the time that we always need to understand like why we're doing that. why, when you go around this portion of the corner, is it most efficient instead of driving here? Because we're manipulating pressures essentially when we're driving. And we have to understand, like, why can't you steer earlier in the corner versus why should you steer later in the corner? Why do you, like, there's a lot of aspects of driving that are so mechanical and like use so many physics that you just have to be able to understand.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting perspective because I mean I could talk to baseball players all day about launch angle and all of these mile per hour of pitches, but I think that when you're doing this kind of sport that you're doing, science plays so much into every second of your competition.
Absolutely. Yes.
Do people come in with prior knowledge of body mechanics, or are they just getting in the sled and going, okay, I'm going downhill
Like
and
the
whatever
mechanics
happens,
of the sled.
happens? Mechanics of the sled, mechanics of their body, mechanics of how the two work together.
I feel like the one thing that I definitely lacked was understanding my body when I came into the sport, that a lot of other athletes they just had from being an elite athlete. Most of these people came from D1 sports and they had played at the extreme level where they really got to understand their bodies and why they get injured, what hurts, why does it hurt. And I had absolutely no conception of that when I first joined the sport. And I feel like I'm starting to develop that, but it's one thing that I definitely lacked, but a lot of other people definitely had. And in terms of the physics of bobsled, I would be very surprised if we had any pilots who came in who like truly understood like how to drive a bobsled exactly before they like got into a bobsled and drove it.
What is the most interesting or unique part about being a pilot for a bobsled that you
Uh,
think is kind of misconstrued or misunderstood?
Um, I would say the cost is one misunderstood thing. It is not the same cost to be a pilot that it is to be a brakeman or a brakeman. The runners are so expensive. They can be upwards of 15 grand. Even I've even heard of 18 grand runners. And we have to have multiple sets of runners. You just for different ice temperatures, for different tracks. Some tracks are harder, you want a thinner runner. Some tracks you want to go really fast on, so you want a fatter runner. But you have less control doing that. But the other, just driving, it is the most unique experience ever to be inside of a bobsled driving it. Because yes, a race, the only thing that I've heard it compared to is being a fighter pilot is in terms of G's, what we're feeling inside the sled. Because the brakemen, they feel it on their back, they're getting pushed down into the sled and we're sitting right up and we're getting those side to side all the time. But driving is such a unique experience to anything that I've ever, to whether you're a brakeman or anything, you just can't even describe what it's like to go be driving down ice.
How fast have you clocked at before?
I've gone, I think, about 81 miles an hour in Park City, maybe 82.
That seems extreme.
Yeah, you can always feel it too. You know when you're going a lot faster than usual. You're at the like 3/4 at the end of the track around curve 14 for me in Park City. And I'm like, whoa, I am flying right now. This is crazy. And I'm like, okay, I just got to get to the end.
That's awesome. How do you see the rest of your life factoring in bobsledding?
So this is actually a very relevant issue for my life right now, which I've been figuring out for the last couple of weeks actually, is I'm in my senior year of college. So I'm really trying to figure out what I'm going to do after this because I obviously can't bobsled for the rest of my life. And the other thing I'm super passionate about is psychology and becoming a therapist, a psychologist. And I really want to factor that into my overall life. And I want to set myself up to be able to do that successfully. But to do that, I need to go to grad school. So we've been trying to figure out for a little while, especially my family and I, what to do exactly. And I have like an overall rough plan. I'm going to aim for 2026 and whether or not what happens, if I make it, if I don't make it, I'm going to go to grad school after that for the next 4 years and then come back to bobsled because my unique experience being so young is I have so many years compared to everybody else to do bobsled. For example, like you're a junior in bobsled until you're 26. So I have 7 more years of being a junior. So it's just, there's so many factors where I can leave the sport for a couple of years and come back to it if I would like, as long as I keep training and such. And I have the driving experience under my belt, but I've kind of made a deal with myself that by 2026, I have to go to grad school for 4 years because I do really want to become a psychologist and I want to work towards my future as well.
Yeah. I think that 2026 is far enough away that you can make that decision and feel confident in it.
Yeah.
We'll go back to bobsled.
And by that time, I'll only be 22. The Olympics will only be 22, and by the time I go to grad school, I'll be 23. So I'm essentially this exact same age that I would actually be if I had just stayed on a normal trajectory of everybody else, kind of my age, doing the high school, college, grad school stepping stool. So I was kind of like, I'll be the identical age as everybody else. I'll finally be in a position where I won't be the absolute youngest by 2, 3 to 7, 8, 9 years. And I was like, this is just the perfect time to go right then.
Yeah, I think that you have some really cool stuff about to happen in your life. I'm like so excited for you. Um, let's see when your episode is coming out. I think we have a pretty quick turnaround time.
Okay.
I think it may be next week, actually.
That's awesome. Okay.
I was wrong. October 5th. So you have a couple weeks.
Okay.
So in the event that anything changes between now and then, October 5th is your date.
Awesome.
In the event that anything changes between now and then, please tell me. I will add it to the script. I also do this fun thing. I think it's fun. I have asked every single guest from season 2 of Closer Mentality to give me a song that either inspires them, chills them out, or reminds them of mental strength. What song would you like to add to the playlist?
That's a really hard one.
The songs on this playlist are insane. It's such an interesting blend of people's interests.
I have pretty alternative music that I listen to. So I'm going to say 15 Years by Houndmouth is a really soul song for me. It is it can hype me up. It can chill me out. It can do pretty much anything to me, but I just really love that song. And I would say I listen to that when I need any sort of pick me up, if I just want to listen to it when I'm sad or anything like that.
And do you have any book recommendations?
Book recommendations
for either people interested in bobsled or psychology specifically?
Psychology specifically, I would always recommend Stephen Holcomb's book. It's so bad, but I can't totally recommend it. I can't remember the title at the moment, but it's Steve Holcomb's autobiography. Or I'm not sure if it's autobiography or if it's written by somebody else, but it's a very awesome book to read.
All right, I have gotten to the end of my questions.
Awesome.
October 5th, I will talk to you again. Any questions for me before we go?
No, I think I'm all set. Thank you so much. This was awesome.
Thank you for speaking so candidly about what you've been through. I really appreciate it. I'm so excited to put your episode together. Good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Have a good one.
I'll talk to you in a few weeks.
Okay, see you.
Bye.